Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners, from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. We may be recovering slowly, tentatively from a long pandemic as in-person interaction cautiously resumes in our daily lives. But there's a sense of comfort in this new normal. There seems to be a pervasive feeling of stress, anxiety, trauma, and depression that continues to linger. In part, we're still grieving the losses inflicted by the last 2+ years, and we're worried that new COVID variants like BA2 may drive up cases again, where masking requirements are reinstated, social isolation dampens our spirits, as well as our recovery. On top of all that, we're nervous about inflation, a possible recession, the growing war in Ukraine, and troubling political and social divisions in our country. So, how do we cope with our anxiety society? How do we find ways to manage and alleviate what increasingly feels like overwhelming stress? In today's episode, Bill Solz, the director of Stress Solutions of New York, talks about his long career exploring ways to help people deal with emotional pain through quicker healing approaches. Bill's journey has given him many different and valuable perspectives as a teacher, childcare worker, university professor, social worker in both public and private schools, and now a licensed clinical social worker with multiple credentials, including certification in anger management and domestic violence. Bill will talk about how he works with individuals and families to promote stress reduction and address the impact of emotional traumas and addictions. He'll explain various treatment approaches he uses to provide quick symptom relief and comprehensive healing. Among them, alternative therapy techniques such as havening and the developmental needs meeting strategy. And at a time when many of us feel pressured to move on in our fast paced culture despite daunting setbacks, Bill will discuss his work as an advanced grief recovery specialist, leading a support group that incorporates treatment as well. So now let's meet our guest, Bill Solz. Bill, welcome to the show.
Uh, Thank you very much, Ron. I've been looking forward to hearing.
Yes, yes. So, Bill, before we dive into a lot of material that's, I think, going to be fascinating for our guests, tell me a little bit about, how you got to where you are today. As I mentioned in my intro, you've had many different perspectives. So, just give me share a little bit of your journey with the listeners.
Sure. So I'll take you way back.
Okay.
So when I was about 8 years old, I was an avid sports fan, particularly related to baseball.
Hmm.
And my thought as an 8-year-old was, how valuable would it be if baseball teams had a therapist on board?
Wow.
They would, be able to help batters avoid long slumps, where they were not hitting well. And if there were interpersonal difficulties, amongst team members, he would be equipped to run groups that would help facilitate communication and help the players get along better. And, you know, um, pretty much I idolized all these ball players. So
Hmm.
the notion of being able to be in that element was particularly exciting for me.
Wow.
So I very much pursued that path. And, you know, um, going into college, I was a psych major. And, uh, and then, going forward, I ultimately pursued social work.
Mm.
I attended Fordham University.
Hmm.
Um, Perhaps I should also mention that while I was in college, I had experienced a major trauma for myself,
Hmm.
in that the person who I was most close to was my grandfather.
Right.
And he had been run over by a car.
Oh, wow.
And I I was completely devastated. And there was about a 10-day period that I visited with him daily at the hospital. He was hooked up to all these tubes. He definitely did not recognize me, and I wasn't going to school. Uh, and then taking that further, after he died, I really couldn't think. I became exceedingly depressed.
Right.
And next thing I knew, I dropped out
Wow.
of college, and in the time when dropping out was not that popular. So my parents were sensitive to my despair, so they got me involved in counseling. And uh, I did get better, but with that, it really left me with a bitter taste. The bitter taste being, why did it have to take so long?
Right.
And when I talk about length of time, it wasn't for another year and a half that I was able to return to college and and then go on with my career. So from that experience, I really developed a strong interest and passion to learn quicker acting healing approaches.
Wow.
And postgraduate, indeed, the first approach that I tried was hypnosis.
Hmm.
However, I did not find that to be particularly helpful
Hmm.
in terms of promoting healing for my clients. I did find it to be helpful for those clients who wanted to stop smoking or lose weight.
Got it. Yeah. Hmm.
By the way, this is not to suggest that hypnosis is not helpful. Indeed, I have many colleagues who actively use hypnosis
Hmm.
in practice,
Hmm.
but that was not my
Right.
experience.
Right.
And then just to go a little further, in 1987, a new treatment approach was developed. Uh, it's called Movement Desensitization Reprocessing,
Right.
otherwise known as EMDR.
Hmm.
And that became the first evidence-based trauma treatment approach
Right.
that there was, at that time.
Right. Right.
And I was fortunate to be trained and certified relatively early on.
Hmm.
And it very much put me on the map as a trauma specialist.
Right.
So that became reflected in the fact that I had become the number one referral source for the Long Island Railroad.
Right.
Indeed, when the engineers were uh, killing people crossing the tracks, and
Mm.
it happened far more frequently than is publicized, those individuals would be so shattered
Right.
emotionally, they can no longer commandeer the train.
Right. Right.
So they would be referred to me. And again, courtesy of EMDR, on average, it would take me 6 sessions to resolve that trauma.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, we've talked broadly before just about the whole issue of trauma and stress and anxiety and just, so there are quicker healing techniques, but there's also a wide, um, you know, uh, uh, experience with these things, which I think, you know, interestingly, some of these things have come forth from the pandemic, just sort of a focus on stress and anxiety and the sense of trauma. Some of these things in the past have, I mean, certainly coming out, veterans coming out of wars, I think that alerted us PTSD.
yeah,
And certainly those are, extreme experiences that a lot of us don't go through. So I don't want to assume that it's the same. We experience the same, as the vets do. Nevertheless, I think there is sort of I think a growing recognition that these are things that we can address and we can confront. We don't I think in our parents' generation experiences from the war or past traumas, we're kind of basically assumed sort of like, what, just get over it, move on. And I think a lot of these things were repressed. And I think, as you and I have had discussions, they do come out. And I think that I think that there's a growing awareness that it's okay. It's not a matter. It's important to destigmatize these situations and to just acknowledge that there are ways to handle it, appropriately, without feeling like you're, somehow pandering or enabling people. I think that's so. I think there's a lot of mythology that needs to be de-mythologized, right?
yeah, definitely so. As a matter of fact, there's a colleague of mine. He's not a clinician, but in fact, he was someone who was exceedingly depressed. And he had gone through so many different kinds of treatment and, medication,
Mm-hmm.
uh, electroshock treatment. And he, um, he really had not gotten better for the longest time. And until he got involved with an integrative psychiatrist who also had him involved in different other natural healing approaches. So his name is Eric Hussin,
Mm-hmm.
K-U-S-S-I-N,
Mm-hmm.
and his mission has been to very much destigmatize mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And he created this tremendous organization. Um, its website is weareallalittlecrazy.org.
Wow.
And his notion is that 5 out of 5 people have mental health issues. And one of the ways that he's looked to bring that whole notion to our consciousness is by getting celebrities, primarily in the
Mm-hmm.
sports field, to open up related to their own, situations in terms of mental health. So, for example,
Mm-hmm.
there's a hockey player who had been sexually abused,
Right.
and his story is on the website. There are countless other, again, athletic celebrities who put their stories out there.
Hmm.
I'm, uh, I was actually honored in terms of attending his breakout introduction of the organization. And when I shared with him a particular healing approach that I'm involved with, it's called havening, he asked me to become the face of havening. And indeed, if anybody so cares to check it out, and it's a wonderful website, um, you'll end up seeing me.
Okay.
Uh, but it's done incredible things. And Eric has brought that whole concept into schools. And indeed, members of the healing community affiliated with the organization have certainly made their presence felt
Mm-hmm.
at different tragedies as well as non-tragedy situations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, now you mentioned havening. Let's talk a little bit more about that. Perhaps you could just explain, Bill, about the treatment, how it works, perhaps some examples of how you used it, how you developed it, and how it may be different from other approaches.
Sure. So because of my background in EMDR, I was fortunate to have been introduced by a colleague who I met in a networking group. His name is Lou Falco, and Lou happens to be a Vietnam War veteran.
Okay.
And he asked me if I knew about havening, and I did not. And Lou introduced me to its co-developer, Dr. Steve Rudin,
Mm-hmm.
who has a practice in Seacliff, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up meeting him. And because of my background in EMDR, uh, Steve gave me a scholarship to become trained in the first ever New York City training. And um, and actually, his twin brother, Ron, is more credited with developing havening. Ron is a Harvard trained neurobiologist. And after about 15 years of research, the two of them combined to come up with this treatment approach. And uh, I have to say, quite frankly, it had blown me away.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, I was dealing with a major trauma in my life, And I could not believe how after about a 20-minute experience where a newly trained colleague
Mm-hmm.
was working with me, what relief I experienced.
Right.
And ever since that weekend training, I've used havening with every single one of my clients
Mm-hmm.
from that day forward. And that was in 2013.
Wow.
So havening is what's regarded as a psychosensory treatment approach.
Okay.
It's it's based on a few concepts. One is the notion of touch. And what Ron had noticed early on, that babies who were experiencing upset seem to calm down through the warm, soothing touch of their caregiver.
Right.
So with that, he postulated that the notion of touch was critical in terms of healing. The other aspect
Mm-hmm.
of havening is uh, to uh, um, to be in touch with your upsetting emotions
Right.
in conjunction with distraction techniques. It's that seems to be the elixir, if you will,
Hmm.
in terms of severing the trauma from a particular part of our brain called the amygdala, which houses trauma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, how you say distraction? How do you do that? I mean, without getting too detailed, but just give a sense of what are we talking about in terms of distraction?
So distraction techniques could be visualization. It
Mm-hmm.
could be, eh, uh, okay, I just finished meeting with a client. I asked her to share with me 5 favorite movies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, asked her to spell something backwards. So
Right. Right.
these are all distraction techniques.
Right.
Doing some humming,
Right.
and it's uncanny
Mm-hmm.
how that in conjunction with the expressing of emotions and the touch
Mm-hmm.
have the ability to very much free individuals from the upset that they've held for many, many years or
Right.
more recently.
Yeah. So, Bill, we need to take a quick break. It'll be a short break. So, when we come back, we'll be talking much more, folks, with Bill Solz, the director of Stress Solutions of New York. After the break, we'll continue this conversation on havening. So, don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with Bill Solz, the director of Stress Solutions of New York. Now, before we continue, I want to just let you know you can find more information about Bill at his website, www.stresssolutionsny.com, where you can learn much more about his work and also read his blog. So, Bill, before the break, we were talking about havening and a little bit about how it works. One of the things that you've mentioned to me is that it's fairly fast healing in terms of its effects, and also that people can learn how to use it. Tell me a little bit more about that, about how it is that you teach it to people. You also teach it to other folks in your field, and how can they learn to use it themselves?
Sure. So, okay, so I could share with you a couple of uh, I could share with you many
Okay.
instances of
Okay.
how quick acting it is. Okay, one of my favorite memories
Hmm.
actually pertain to my working with a Vietnam War veteran,
Right.
and he he was very motivated and meeting with me actively each week until one day he canceled, and I was puzzled. And when I questioned him, he said it's because of the rain,
Okay.
and I was really confused because this is a guy who'd been in the swamps of Vietnam, more than 50 years earlier. So after questioning him, he ends up telling me that it's really not the rain, it was the thunder. So when he said that, I knew what his issue was. So
Okay.
I said, why don't you come in tomorrow? It's going to be a sunny day. And indeed, we met. And I asked him to think back to an earlier memory where he heard loud, upsetting noises. And it immediately brought him back to this battle in Vietnam. And sure enough, we addressed that with havening. So this was an event more than 50 years earlier where two of his buddies were killed. And in the course of that one session, his level of upset, which was at a 9, as he reflected on that memory, went down to a 0. And what proceeded to occur was each week he would come into me and he would say to me, "That rain don't bother me no more."
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of how quick acting it can be. I had another woman who happened to be a nurse, and she was now in job jeopardy. And she'd been meeting with a psychiatrist who had been giving her medication. And the problem was she was only sleeping a maximum of 4 hours a night
Mm-hmm.
at 2 2-hour intervals. So when I met with her, the first session I have with a client is an intake where I try to understand, their present situation as well
Mm-hmm.
as background information. And she shared with me that she had broken up with her boyfriend 4 months ago.
Right.
And I asked her how upsetting was that event, and she said, it wasn't that big a deal. It was at a 4. Anyway, I do a thing called energy testing, and after that, it turned out her level of upset was at an 8. So we scheduled another session 3 days later. So on the follow-up, I asked her how was she doing, and she said, "Let me put it to you like this: I now go to bed at 10:30, and I wake up at 7. I sleep straight through the night."
Mm.
So this is just after one session of havening.
Wow. Wow.
And the beautiful thing about havening, not only are my clients able to experience significant relief in person, but after I take them through the process, they now are educated enough to be able to use it for themselves.
Right.
So I've since come to regard havening as the most effective self-emotional regulation technique there is.
Wow. Wow. So in a thematic sense, so basically it going back to what you mentioned before, the approach is essentially a way to sort of change the narrative or get something. How do you get a story out of someone's head through distraction? Is
Yeah,
that accurate?
yeah. And and again, it uses touch, which I always compare havening to EMDR.
Okay.
And so the touch is significantly important because when I used EMDR with clients in the past, some of them would have what are called abreactions.
Mm-hmm.
When they'd go back in time to that earlier memory, it would be so exceedingly disturbing, they would have tremendous difficulty.
Right.
And how might that be manifested? By crying, screaming, things of that nature. With havening, because we're utilizing touch, which is actually hardwired into us
Mm-hmm.
from the time we were infants by our caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
So incorporating the touch is self-soothing.
Right.
And I experience no abreactions with my clients.
Now, how do you incorporate touch? Be a little bit more.
Yeah,
Give us an
so
example.
it's very simple. So basically, I look at it as in 3 parts, and
Mm-hmm.
if the individual's uncomfortable with using any of them, any part, they need not. But so the first part would be taking one's hands and going down from the forehead down their cheeks. Second part would be crossing over with your arms so
Mm-hmm.
that your left arm touches your right shoulder and right arm touches the left shoulder, and going down from the shoulders to your elbows. So that's the second part. And the third part is just like washing your hands.
Mm-hmm.
So I have my clients go through those three parts
Mm-hmm.
uh, throughout.
Right.
And actually, interestingly enough, I had done a workshop once where somebody was touch averse.
Hmm.
And so it turned out I suggested to her that, she could actually touch, a, a soft object, in a similar fashion. And
Right.
indeed, she ended up using touch on her dog.
Wow.
And she found that to be very helpful as
Wow.
well.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now you use other things as well, and that some of the things that we've talked about, and
Yeah.
thought maybe you can talk about what's known as DNMS, Developmental Needs Meeting Strategy. Talk
Yeah.
about how that compares with havening and
Okay.
contrasts.
So the uh, the developmental needs meeting strategy was developed by Shirley Jean Schmidt, and she was a former EMDR clinician.
Okay.
And basically, that is related to addressing inner child wounds along with attachment related issues.
Mm.
So, from my perspective, the two major aspects, in addition to genetics, that contribute to personality are trauma and attachment.
Okay.
And so the developmental needs meeting strategy is much more comprehensive than havening. It's very, very supportive,
Mm-hmm.
and it it's incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, the other nice thing about it is sometimes we as individuals tend to take on negative messages from significant others, such as "you're not good enough,"
Okay.
"you'll never amount to anything," "you're a loser." Those kinds of negative messages become velcroed onto us,
Hmm.
usually from early on, although it can happen from recent, situations,
Right.
taking negative messages from a spouse, for example. And holding on to those negative messages very much disempower each of us.
Right.
And I can tell you that uh, the most common theme that I get from clients who go through the DNMS is the response of liberation.
Hmm.
They recognize how liberating uh, and liberated they feel after having experienced.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that these are, valuable tools people should know about. I certainly, when my show is 45 forward, so a lot of these things crop up in the latter half of life. But a lot of times they're connected to early parts of our life, as you have indicated. And I want to just talk about, yeah, so these issues come up with clients my age or younger, but also you work with, families and children too. So um, talk a little bit about that. I mean, you've had experience also as a childcare worker, as a teacher. You've worked as a social worker in schools. So talk about some of the similarities and differences of working with children as opposed to people getting as they get older.
Yeah. So, uh, as you indicated, yeah, I've actually had a very rich background
Hmm.
working with children.
Right.
I was living in a cottage, running a cottage of 16 emotionally disturbed kids
Mm.
for 2 years, along with a colleague, a coworker, and that was a tremendous experience for me. And it actually preceded my entry into graduate school for social work. Following in between childcare and social work, I had also worked as a paraprofessional teacher and then a teacher for a short time. And then, I recognized for myself that I really did not like dealing with the behavior management piece with the children. So,
Okay.
but I always knew that, I wanted to be a therapist. So I then went, well, fast forward into graduate school, and I was fortunate after having worked 2 years in a diagnostic center with acting out adolescents to be able to get a position in the New York City school system where I continued for 26 years.
Wow.
So
Okay.
I was working at actually all three levels, elementary, junior high, as well as high school. And during that whole period of time, I concurrently had my private practice. So I would have to say that working with children, was always like my first love.
Hmm.
And as a matter of fact, I used to question myself, well, could I really work with adults?
Huh.
And and lo and behold, it happened. so
Okay.
actually, kind of how I got my start in as a therapist, it turned out there was an agency that basically took referrals in two different kind of fashions.
Okay.
All the referrals either came due to marriage counseling situations, or they were related to DWI, driving while intoxicated.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, I knew nothing of each. and
Wow.
I ended up getting, uh, I found for myself, I was exceedingly uncomfortable when he assigned me the first couple to work with.
Hmm.
And I begged out of that. And I exclusively was working with uh, drug and alcohol related individuals. And when I came to recognize that that agency's practices really were unethical, I then went for additional training and became a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor. And very much in the beginning of my work, 90% of my clients came for those issues.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I find it interesting, Bill. I mean, obviously that, you deal with a lot of psychological issues, but I think what's interesting too is the intermingling of psychological and social issues. I mean, and so that's why I find your work as a social worker, instructive that, a lot of these things involve a complex matrix of issues. Um, so we're actually going to take another quick break, Bill. But folks, when we come back, we have a lot more to talk about in our last segment with Bill Solz, the Director of Stress Solutions of New York. So don't go anywhere. There's much more to come. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with Bill Solz, a licensed clinical social worker. Now, before the break, we were talking with Bill about the work he does dealing with anxiety and stress and trauma with children. But he also does a lot of work on the flip side with parents. So, Bill, tell us a bit about your work with parents and your parenting workshops and how you get involved in that.
Um, okay, so uh, I have two daughters, and
Mm-hmm.
quite frankly, when they were ages 5 and 3,
Mm-hmm.
um, I I really felt that I was not having as strong a connection or bond with them as I should or
Mm-hmm.
could. And I really couldn't attribute it strictly to gender. So I ended up getting involved myself in where I attended a parenting workshop. It was
Right.
a 12-session program that one of my colleagues, a psychologist, was holding. And he invited me to check out one session.
Right.
And my gosh, I got hooked. I swallowed it uh, completely. And um, and then I very much came to realize, okay, I should even back up. Honestly, I thought if there was ever going to be a great parent, it was going to be me.
Right.
The reason I say that is I uh, I always wanted to be a father.
Hmm.
I was highly motivated, and all my background experience in terms of being a childcare worker, a teacher, and then a clinical social worker had all the ingredients right in front of me for me to achieve just that, but it wasn't happening. And then I came to realize through that involvement that there's a whole nother aspect that is culturally ignored, and
Hmm.
that is related to uh, becoming an effective parent.
Right.
So we're taught how to have children, how not to have children, but when we get them, we're not really taught what to do with them.
Hmm.
And so I very much became engulfed in parent effectiveness training. And indeed, I've been providing that for my clients going forward. Indeed, when I was in the schools, I used to provide parenting workshops on a monthly basis. And some of the students used to tell their moms, yeah, keep going to Mr. Solz. You're, you're actually doing better.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, I think that uh, I had children a little later on the side of marriage than most people, but I do recall after doing my what I thought was due diligence and reading all these parenting books, there was an awful lot that was not in those books, and it was about the emotional components of parenting and the kinds of feeling you mentioned. You mentioned like anger management. So, I mean, as you well know, those early wonderful days of having an infant are also quite traumatic for you in terms of never getting any sleep, of dealing with issues like what is that about? Which I take them to the doctor, all sorts of things. So I think it's important to weigh in with these issues with someone.
As a matter of fact, Ron, I, I've been fortunate to learn a lot of things over my years, and I would hold parent effectiveness training as perhaps number one, because it enabled me to really, I think, do a great job as a parent. And testimony to that is my daughters, till this day, are like my best friends.
Right. Great. Right. And another thing that you've mentioned to me in our past discussions is the importance of these early periods too, is that what, again, on sort of flipping back and forth, what happens to children as young people, often the traumas or the behaviors or the abuses come return as adults, right?
Mhm.
In other words, they may be traumatized by stuff, but they also often repeat behaviors.
Yeah. Uh, as a matter of fact, there's a famous book, The Past is Always Present. And,
Oh, okay.
you know, as a matter of fact, I'm very much follow that belief in the sense that when I work with clients, I very much look to address not only their present uh, upset, but perhaps even more importantly, its etiology. And
Hmm.
its etiology usually is housed in unresolved emotional earlier upset, which Havening and the developmental needs meeting strategy just do a wonderful job in terms of addressing.
Right, right. And one of the related issues that you're involved in is with grief recovery. And so, with both parents and children, there's been a lot of talk, obviously, as a result of the pandemic, about dealing with grief and dealing with, stress and trauma. Uh, and I think that's, it certainly has shown a spotlight on it. But I think these issues, as most people acknowledge, have always been there. Perhaps that it's been there's been a brighter focus because of the isolation of the pandemic. But the issue of grief, dealing with the pandemic, and some actual physical losses, but also feeling of loss in life, is something that's difficult. And I think just starting to come out now, really, as things subside. So talk a little bit about that, about how you work with that. And I know you do some workshops in this capacity too.
Uh, okay, so first, I should mention the fact that each of us has experienced the pandemic. The pandemic represents another trauma. And one of the reasons individuals have had such difficulty coping is that our brain does not have the ability to sort out trauma. So when we experience a new trauma, it tends to reactivate earlier unresolved trauma.
Hmm.
So some of the emotional difficulties people are having were not singularly related to the trauma of the pandemic.
Right.
And so, uh, so in terms of helping people related to some of the grief related aspects, I have to say that over the years, I know that I've done a very good job in terms of addressing my clients' needs, in terms of helping them overcome the trauma of whatever loss. However, I also came to recognize that there was an emotional piece
Mm-hmm.
that, let's say, Havening was unable to really effectively address.
Okay.
And so as a result, I ended up pursuing additional training. And indeed, I'm glad to say I'm now regarded as an advanced certified grief recovery specialist. So that deals with the whole emotional residue in terms of the relationship. So, for example, there are all these undelivered communications that we may have experienced, things that we wanted to say but didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, things that we should have said, and so the grief recovery method is actually the only evidence-based approach of its kind, where at this juncture it's been utilized for more than 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
and literally millions of people worldwide
Right.
have been beneficiaries
Mm-hmm.
of the method.
Right.
And it does a wonderful job of helping the individual come to better terms
Right.
with their loss.
Yeah. Now, could you just I know it probably is fairly extensive, but can you just give me an outline of sort of what is the method, a bit of the methodology
Uh,
involved?
sure. So actually, it's the program is a very structured one
Mm-hmm.
uh, that would encompass 8 sessions.
Okay.
And so, unlike bereavement support groups, which are great,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think the advantage of the grief recovery method is that it has a beginning and an end,
Mm-hmm.
and in which we're able to do a wonderful job in terms of addressing loss. So the first actual couple sessions are related to helping us get in touch with some of the myths that we've been that we've learned, all
Right.
of us have learned,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of dealing with loss.
Right.
You know, statements like, you know, don't feel bad, replace the loss.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, somebody, uh, you know, may have broken up with a loved one. There are plenty of fish in the sea.
Right.
Um,
Right.
uh, I know, and again, these kinds of statements are all well-meaning by other individuals, but
Right.
we have not, as a society, been taught how to deal with loss. So uh, as a result, some of the statements that come from others are indeed hurtful, because then they're really not dealing, they're dealing with the thoughts and not the broken hearts. And the grief recovery method is all about dealing with those broken hearts. So statements like, you know what, she's in a better place, or God gives us all that we can handle.
Right.
Somebody had also said after uh, someone had lost a child, said, well, at least you have three others.
Oh boy.
Again, if you think about it, as a society, we're totally neglectful, I think, in three aspects. One, and basically two of which we're all guaranteed to experience. One is how to deal with stress,
Right.
and number two, how do we deal with grief?
Right. Right.
And number three, which is a biggie, how do we parent
Right.
effectively?
Right.
So those are my pet peeves
Right.
related to our society.
Right. Well, Bill, on that note, unfortunately, we have to end our show, but I'm glad we ended on those three notes of focus. So we're going to have to leave it there for today, but I'm glad you brought up these issues and many provocative thoughts for helping people deal with stress and anxiety and trauma. So before we close, if people have questions or comments for you, what's the best way for people to contact you?
Um, okay, well, I think it's easy enough to remember my website, stresssolutions.ny.com. So there are three S's in the middle.
Okay.
And I also have an easy enough phone number, and that's 855 less stress.
Easy to remember, good to remember. Great. Okay. Well, folks, you could also reach Bill. He's on LinkedIn, of course, and Facebook, so you can get some contact with him there. And once again, if you tell your friends if they missed my conversation with Bill today, you could listen to it on a podcast on voiceamerica.com. Just search for my show, 45 Forward. You can also listen to it on my website, roelresources.com. Just click on the 45 Forward tab. So be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, when I'll be talking with Virginia Morris. Gigi Morris is the author of the iconic resource for family caregivers, How to Care for Your Aging Parents. So until then, folks, keep moving forward, 45 Forward.